Good afternoon and welcome. We'll get started. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. We are in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, and we are very happy to be collaborating with the College of Education today. I will introduce our distinguished speaker in a minute. First, I'd like to thank some individuals who are responsible for pulling this gathering together. Dr. Kate Seaman in the back, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, and our students, our Graduate Assistant, Eden Adhanom, and our very fancy social media intern, Zoe Lebovic. Thank you for your assistance today. So today's presentation by Dr. Zacharia, which is entitled Ordinary Solidarities Towards an Anticolonial and Anti-Racist Agenda in Global Education Governance, is really very important to the Bahá'í Chair, the topic, because we are interested always in finding solutions to intractable problems, to the obstacles to peace in our troubled world. In a time of turmoil about migration and the needs of refugees, today's talk, I think, gives us an opportunity to contemplate new approaches. Professor Zacharia's consideration of education in this context is both new and a re-embrace of an older concept. And by that I mean the concept of solidarity, the notion of solidarity that speaks to a kind of mutually enforcing corporate endeavor for which we all bear responsibility. Professor Zacharia explains, and I quote, "Violence worldwide has prompted forced migration on an unprecedented scale, creating complex challenges for education, particularly in the global south, where most of the world's refugees reside. The widespread endorsement of education as a universal human right has given rise to a burgeoning field of global engagement in education to meet the needs of refugee learners. However," she says, "growing attention to long-standing issues linked to racism and coloniality in humanitarian assistance has impelled important conversations in recent years." And I think you will hear her address these issues. So let me just tell you a little bit about her before I invite her to come up. Dr. Zina Zacharia is Assistant Professor of International Education Policy at the University of Maryland. Her research examines education and peace building in contexts of conflict and advances a critical approach to refugee studies in the Middle East. These interests stem from over 2 decades of educational research, which she has been engaged in, as well as teaching and school leadership in war-affected contexts. She has a Twainee Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and a Middle Eastern Studies postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University. We are really delighted to have her with us today, and I would like to invite her up to speak for us. Thank you, Dr. Zacharia.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to share some of my research on communities supporting refugee education, both at the local level and also at the level of global education governance. In my talk today, I'll provide some of the observations from research I conducted with colleagues Francine Menashe at the University of Toronto and Maha Shaib at the Center for Lebanese Studies, as well as some of my ongoing work with actors involved in global education governance. And by that, I mean spaces of global level policymaking, financing, and advocacy in education in emergencies. So we'll explore the workings of these organizations with educational mandates, mainly state and non-state actors headquartered in the global north, with activities extending across countries predominantly located in the global south. And then we'll consider what might be learned when we instead center the workings of local and refugee-led organizations. So as a starting point, I would like to share excerpts from a poem entitled Home by Somali-British writer and poet Warsan Shire, who reminds us that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And yet there were over 108 million forcibly displaced people at the end of 2022, constituting the largest number of forcibly displaced people in history, and more than 2.5 times the number a decade ago. And while children account for 30% of the world's population, they comprise a disproportionate 40% of all forcibly displaced people. People seeking refuge cross physical geographies, seas, deserts, jungles, and airways, and they cross emotional geographies. And the media images that depict them evoke fear, disgust, pity, and other complex emotions. Yet people on the move are met physically with armies, fences, walls, and politically by continental policies of containment, nationalist ideologies that are concerned about preserving national culture, the politics of authoritarianism, and a wider anti-migrant sentiment across the world. And these issues, they converge in schools, where young people move from these extraordinary contexts of violent conflict and forced displacement to the ordinary violences of everyday schooling. My interest in these issues emerges from scholarly, professional, and personal concerns. As an educator and researcher in war-affected contexts spanning almost 30 years, and from my own experience of displacement due to conflict, my elite university training in the United States, my facility in English, and my privileges as a light-skinned person of color in the context of the global north have also advanced my career and facilitated my access to global education governance spaces, where I have witnessed firsthand the imposition of northern epistemologies and ways of working through my professional service to global and Middle East regional working groups and so-called expert panels and policy forums. So in this way, my understanding of refugee education has been shaped by complex and contradictory colonial formations and effects, including war, forced migration, and discrimination, as well as by immense privilege. And so my observations and remarks today are, about ordinary solidarities, are born of a deep knowledge from professional and personal experience. So over the last 2 decades, the widespread endorsement of education as a universal human right has given rise to this burgeoning field of global engagement in education in emergencies, and that includes refugee education. And following calls for education for all, and growing recognition that the right to education should extend to children in armed conflict, forced migration, and disaster, education was established as a pillar of international humanitarian aid and integral to the international humanitarian response system. The global architecture seeks to ensure that all children receive a quality education, as articulated in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and numerous international declarations, frameworks, and legal instruments. The largest global governance organizations include those like the World Bank, United Nations agencies, and certain bilateral donors. And they were established on such stated principles as charity in the post-World War II reconstruction phase, and to support basic needs in countries experiencing high levels of poverty. These mandates have expanded considerably, and they now include support for a range of social services, including education, all the way from childhood to adulthood, via funding and policymaking, project design and implementation, technical advising, advocacy, and so on. Global non-governmental organizations, for example, Save the Children, Oxfam, etc., and companies like Microsoft and Pearson, foundations, for example, the Lego Foundation and others, have also become major contributors to education around the world and in contexts of conflict. In recent years, the education and emergencies sector celebrated a significant fundraising milestone, in part reflecting support for refugees from Ukraine in high-income countries. Yet, even more resources were allocated to armed conflicts, killing an unprecedented number of children and causing what Palestinian scholar Karma Nabulsi termed scholasticide nearly 15 years ago, the deliberate state-sanctioned destruction of education infrastructure. And while the greatest share of forcibly displaced people are now in low and middle-income countries in the global south, the last 2 decades witnessed the global expansion of the education and emergencies industry through organizations and actors based largely in high-income countries in the global north. So critics of humanitarian assistance point out that within the system, actors and organizations based in the global north, such as United Nations agencies and multilateral banks, high-income country donors, and NGOs, they hold most power over decision-making in education policy, finance, and programming, whereas actors and organizations based in the global south, including refugee communities and other recipients of foreign aid, they remain in the least influential positions over issues that affect their lives. Critics assert that inequitable relationships in rights-based interventions reflect colonial inheritances, structural dynamics, and deficit views about local actors and affected communities who are commonly portrayed as lacking capacity, agency, credibility, relevant skills, and knowledge. Furthermore, critics cite saviorism as a pervasive orientation of benevolence or charity, reproduced through paternalistic relationships that cast local and refugee actors as objects of rescue. Critics also point out that aid interventions reinscribe the authority of northern experts and undermine local and indigenous knowledges, and they further describe the racialization of this expertise. So growing attention to these power imbalances in recent years has led people to question how partnerships that support the right to education also perpetuate global inequities, particularly in a field that flourishes in response to devastation and operates by the same colonial, imperialist, racialized, saviorist, and capitalist logics. In my research with Francine Menashe and Maha Shaib, and supported by others, Robin Shields and Therese Cregan, we observed power asymmetries within education and emergencies partnerships, and how some partnerships manage to address power imbalances and create more meaningful partnerships. Global education actors in our work were unequivocal that donors, largely based in the global north, hold most power in wielding their fiscal resources. And our network analysis of 440 organizations working to support Syria refugee education in Lebanon supported the widespread agreement among global actors that power and decision-making rested with global actors. This chart, for example, displays the widespread participation of international actors, including international organizations, bilateral agencies, foundations, and companies headquartered in the global north, represented by these dark dots, whereas those headquartered in Lebanon are these light dots. Our network analysis further lent evidence to power asymmetries between organizations. The degree centrality measures show that international organizations hold central positions in the network with more ties than any other group. So while international organizations hold more central positions within the network, as highlighted by the yellow bar here, it's also important to recognize that, if you look at the numbers of organizations, there are relatively few international organizations overall in the network, and the small number holds a disproportionately large number of connections. In contrast, if you look here at the local and national NGOs, they're much more numerous, but they have fewer ties. So why does this matter? Our research shows that an organization's location in the network, its centrality, reflects more opportunities, stronger ties to more actors, and the ability to determine or distort flows of information, and thereby wield influence and power. So power is expressed not only through fiscal resources, but also in how relationships are organized, structured, and how they function through partnerships, including who has the power to define and disseminate knowledge, standards, and ways of working. And in reflecting on these power dynamics between partners, one NGO worker, a representative from Lebanon, said to us, "In the end, you are not equal. They plan and you execute, and they can stop at any time." The 2020 escalation in the Black Lives Matter movement and growing calls to decolonize global development and humanitarianism led many organizations to acknowledge the need for structural change to address these power imbalances. Many organizations released statements decrying racism in the sector and signed pledges to initiate change. As a respondent explained, there's been a big internal reckoning. There's a way that it plays out in the United States, but there's a way, too, that it plays out in other parts of the world, very much tied with a decolonization framework. Frankly, for the field of development and for international education, it is long overdue to have this discussion. Yet these power structures, for now, appear to remain deeply entrenched, where issues of race, as several respondents noted to us, are nowhere even on the agenda. My research with Francine Menashe has demonstrated how white ignorance serves to uphold these exact inequities in education and emergencies. The concept of white ignorance was advanced by Charles Mills, a Jamaican scholar whose groundbreaking work, The Racial Contract, first introduced the idea of an epistemology of ignorance, or what he described as white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race. This ignorance is enabled by white racial privilege, and it allows particular people to ignore or minimize the impacts of white supremacy and the role it plays within society, and allows the reproduction of structural racism in which white people are able to fully benefit from racial hierarchies precisely because they do not understand or acknowledge the racist world in which they live. They have the privilege to ignore it. Furthermore, white ignorance hinges on a general skepticism about non-white cognition, assuming a lack of credibility in non-white capacities, knowledge, and perspectives. While certainly perpetuated through individuals, white ignorance relies on white supremacist structures. The concept helps us to understand racial inequities across global settings. Insofar as the modern world has been created by European colonialism and imperialism, and insofar as racist assumptions, frameworks, norms were central to the theories justifying white Western conquest and domination of that world, we would expect white ignorance to be global. Francine and I apply Mills's concept to global education governance to explain our observations of racial erasure, a retrospective whiting out, or whitewashing, in the words of Mills, of the racial past in order to construct an alternative narrative that severs the present from any legacy of racial domination. Our writing on white ignorance was spurred by an experience that we had a few years ago. We were working together on a consultancy. We had been hired by this big international organization to draft a policy brief about education for refugee children and issues around marginalization. So we researched and we wrote this policy brief, and we did a few drafts, and any of you who have done this kind of work, you know it goes back to the organization, and they'll put in some edits, and you redraft it according to how they want you to give it shape. So we got the organization's feedback, and in one of the early drafts, we referred to historically marginalized groups, such as racial and ethnic minorities or students with low socioeconomic status. And we received this comment: best to avoid references to the controversial term of race and keep within the more acceptable term of ethnic minorities. So we were asked, quite literally, to erase race from the document. We were a bit stunned by this request, not so much because of the suggestion to use a different term, maybe terminology can be debated and changed, but more because we were asked to delete race from a policy brief on marginalization in education in order to avoid controversy, to sanitize it a little bit. So our research, which was published in Harvard Education Review, presents evidence of what Mills describes as racial erasure, denying white supremacy as a global system, the neglect of racial social structural factors, and material group interests as central in generating and sustaining these dynamics. For example, we reviewed 227 documents that were published by Northern-based international organizations between 2011 and 2020. And in these 227 documents, only 20 mentioned race. And when we took a look at those, many of them were just cursory mentions. There were, in fact, only 2 that had a discussion of race or racism in them. Instead, the documents used euphemisms related to inequities between rich donor countries in the global north and global south countries that received aid. For example, they made broad references to discrimination or marginalization without language that specified race or racism. So when the 2020 protests in support of Black Lives Matter led certain organizations to voice their solidarity, some respondents observed that other global education agencies were concerned about, quote, the politicized nature of this movement, unquote. And so, and I quote, there was a complete silencing of conversations, unquote. Another described it as, quote, just challenging and, basically our anti-racism stuff just fell flat organizationally, unquote. So this inclination to silence discussions on race, deeming the subject politicized, controversial, or even taboo, or the tendency to divert conversations on race to address the concerns of white people reflect racial erasure. and an effort on the part of actors within global education governance to construct an alternative narrative separated from current and past racism, one through which white ignorance is perpetuated. Okay, so now that we've explored some of the issues emerging from this body of work, I'd like to turn to some of the promising partnership practices that we've also encountered that help to address the power inequities to create more meaningful partnerships in refugee education. So in this work, we intentionally selected as case studies from a wider sample those partnerships that appeared from an initial survey to function in positive ways and with strong outcomes. And interestingly, these partnerships overall did not seem to suffer from overt power imbalances, at least not to the same degree as suggested by other aspects of our research. So although the case studies involve different types of organizations, each prioritized participatory practices and local knowledges. They exhibited similar practices, which I'll share shortly, and they sustained their partnerships and their educational programs through acute crises. I'm about to show you a brief video that captures what we learned from local and refugee partners about what it would take to transform humanitarian relations. So it's just a 2-minute.
In 2018, we asked ourselves, what would it take to transform relationships in education in emergencies? Over 3 years, we sought to understand how organizations working together can best support education for Syria refugees across Lebanon through partnerships. From evidence collected from global organizations, a network analysis, and country case studies, we arrived at 5 ways in which partnerships in education in emergencies can support and sustain learning for refugees. These we refer to as guiding principles. Principle 1. A shift in orientation from saviorism to care. Principle 2, a move from a culture of monitoring and outputs to a culture of trust and respect. Principle 3, a shift from prioritizing coordination to a focus on ongoing and organic communication. Principle 4, a change from capacity building to mutual learning and multi-directional knowledge sharing. And lastly, Principle 5, a shift in power imbalances through self-reflection, awareness, and interrogation. These 5 principles emerge from over 100 interviews, 250 documents, over 30 observations of partnership activities, and a network analysis of 440 organizations working in Lebanon. Through seeking the 5 partnership principles, meaningful partnerships can result, and in turn will better support education in emergencies.
So in our remaining time, I want to focus on the work of everyday school actors in Lebanon, a refugee hostile transit country, and how these actors secured and protected the right to education for children from Syria within a significant broader context of multiple compounding crises. I use the notion of ordinary solidarities to describe this refugee education response and draw out implications for ongoing efforts to reconfigure humanitarian relations and structures. So in 2011, the war in Syria initiated mass displacement on an unprecedented scale. There was an estimated 5.6 million Syrians who sought refuge in neighboring countries, including 1.5 million in Lebanon, a lower income country with the largest per capita refugee population in the world. So a combination of forces led to the influx of Syrians into the neighborhood of what I call our faith school. It's a pseudonym for the school, including a northern thrust to prevent migrants from reaching Europe through policies of containment. So from the outset, government and society in Lebanon were deeply divided over the Syria crisis and consequently assistance to refugees. The situation led to explicit acts of discrimination, stereotyping, scapegoating, and violence against Syrians, including in schools. Attempts by refugees and everyday citizens to uphold the right to education for Syrian refugees in Lebanon have taken place within a significant larger context of multiple compounding crises, including state fragility, political unrest and financial crisis, COVID-19, and a massive explosion in Beirut port that wrought human devastation and damage to vital civil infrastructure. Deteriorating conditions for all have increased anti-refugee sentiment and affected the ability of schools to function over the past few years. And it's against this backdrop that our faith school sought to support Syrian refugee students. Now, I use Safa Dai and Asgharzade's anti-colonial discursive framework to write against racism and coloniality in refugee education, which manifest in aid structures, relationships, and orientations, including the specific embodiments of Northern epistemic authority and saviorism. Safa Dai and Asgharzade's anti-colonial discursive framework envisions a common zone of resistance against colonial tendencies in research and practice, building on insights from indigenous research traditions, anti-racist works, and spaces, and I quote, created by Marxist, feminist, post-colonialist, and deconstructionist struggles, unquote. It seeks to forge solidarities among anti-oppression activists in both academic spheres and in larger society. So these interconnectivities are significant for humanitarian critique, given the colonial inheritances of aid and the, quote, insidious attempts to deny the validity of the knowledges shared by certain bodies who may not follow conventionally accepted methods of theorizing, unquote. Our faith school was a small school in a poor neighborhood of Beirut. It enrolled students from diverse backgrounds, reflecting its neighborhood, and only half were Lebanese citizens, and the other half came from other backgrounds, including Syrians, Kurds, Armenians, and displaced Iraqis. The school also enrolled the children of domestic workers, and this level of integration of diverse religions, nationalities, and socioeconomic groups was really not typical for a Lebanese private school. The school also exhibited racial and ethnic diversity. As a neighborhood school in an impoverished area, the school had always enrolled economically vulnerable students, with most students paying partial tuition and some paying none at all. The dean of the school said to me, "We don't send kids home, we just try to keep them." And after 2012, however, the population of school-aged children from Syria increased dramatically in the neighborhood of the school, with hundreds of thousands of refugees coming in. Quote, many of the kids could not find a school, unquote, and so the enrollment of refugees at Old Faith School occurred organically at first. It started with a few families that had 7 or 8 children at the very beginning. We felt obligated to get involved in helping the Syrian families who came to Lebanon. We wanted to build a good relationship with them, to accompany them on their journey. And then, in the words of the dean, it was a flood. And I quote, so we didn't sit down and say, we're going to register Syrian kids, but no one said that we shouldn't either. And it just happened, really. And in this way, our faith school initiated a refugee education response to support an influx of children despite their very limited resources. On a kindergarten classroom door, it read, "Welcome to KG1," and a snow scene with cotton balls glued to blue construction paper greeted the students alongside green pine trees decorated with red pom-poms. Inside the classroom, children sat around a rectangular table, busy in a learning activity with their teacher, who sat at the table with them, interacting with each child. All of the children appeared to be engaged in the activity, animated, moving in their seats, laughing and talking with each other and with the teacher. Our faith schools partnerships appeared to have a positive impact on Syrian students' academic and social integration into the school community. Their international partner supported students financially by removing a significant barrier to integration. A Lebanese partner organization also supported the enrollment of students through referrals and tuition contributions, and it provided an academic support structure and follow-up through an afternoon program. So with measures of support taken at the school, in communication with parents, the school support staff, and the organizations who served as partners, Syrian students remained in school. The dean remarked, I can't think of anyone who has dropped out. He described their approach to integrating refugee students and families as simply being inclusive of everyone. We never devised a system for the Syrian parents. The school system applies to everyone, he said. For example, the school met regularly with all the parents, and they had a part-time psychologist who supported all of the students. The school also had a parent committee, and that year they had elected both Lebanese and Syrian officers to lead it, signaling a measure of family integration. So, on one visit to the school, I observed the dean disciplining a pair of boys. They had been misbehaving in class, and the teacher came out and complained, and he said, "Excuse me," he walked out of the office where I was speaking to him, and he spoke to them in the hallway in a manner that evoked kindness, asking for their perspective on what happened in class. They claimed that the lesson was boring, and the dean asked them to consider the effort that the teacher was making to teach them, and that they might express their feedback politely to the teacher. He accompanied them back to their classroom, where they apologized to the teacher. But before she could accept the apology, the school bell rang for lunch. And so then students started streaming out of all of their classrooms for lunch, and they animatedly made their way down the stairs into the courtyard. And as they passed the dean on the stairs, they greeted and they high-fived him. He spoke to each of them by name, asking how they were doing. They skipped down the stairs and they sat or stood in groups in the courtyard, eating their sandwiches. The dean remarked, "You see how they are? There's no child standing alone or left out. You can't tell who's Syrian or who's Lebanese. They're just together as children." All of the students interacted with the dean on the stairs and with other children in the courtyard, suggesting that the students indeed were well integrated into school life. However, the integration of Syrian students and families was not without its difficulties. The dean cautioned that in their integration into school life, we should not take that as a sign that they were fully accepted or integrated into wider society, or even the community around the school. Some parents didn't want to put their children in classes with Syrian students. They removed their children from the school. The school didn't bow to this pressure, even though it was financially vulnerable and needed their tuition. So even though these fee-paying families left the school because of its policy of integrating Syrians, the school continued to receive and support Syrian refugees. They also actively sought to mitigate discrimination against Syrian refugee students through equity-oriented tuition practices and integration into all facets of school life, including addressing issues with students and parents and within the school community. So how do we go about doing that? Solving that challenge of community discrimination against Syrian students, we phrase our rules in terms of being a loving community, being a respectful community to each other, regardless of what's happening outside, and reflecting on wider political tensions affecting the community and the school's approach to mitigating them. Our faith school's dean concluded, we don't have a big strategy. We just try to encourage people to accept each other. Lebanon's crises deeply impacted our faith school, its community, and its partnerships. The school's financial vulnerability was magnified by a deepening economic crisis, COVID-19, and the explosion that obliterated homes and livelihoods, including several families in the school. People struggled with finances and they were unable to pay their tuition fees. Despite being tuition dependent, the school did not ask students to leave. As the situation continued to deteriorate, our faith school persisted in serving students. We have a lot of people who are in need now, and the main difference is that there are more Lebanese students in need than before. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the initial depreciation of the Lebanese lira, the school even reduced teacher salaries to 75%. Despite these challenges, they persisted in supporting refugee students through various means, identifying new sponsors and organizing fundraising events. Because we want to help our families. The political crisis, the pandemic, and the devastation resulted in multiple forced closures. Teaching became harder, and then the school went entirely online. Like other schools, our faith school transitioned to online learning in a context where few students and teachers had the required technology, connectivity, electricity, or know-how. Many of our students are refugees with no access to Wi-Fi, or they don't have a smart pad or laptop. In some cases, a family has just one phone, so this makes online teaching more challenging. Still, the school adjusted to support them, delivering teaching via WhatsApp. The pivot to virtual learning, while challenging and not without multiple problems, was done quickly and flexibly and with kindness and humor. Here are just some examples from virtual observations. These are screenshots from lessons created and held via WhatsApp. In the last image, you can see the students laughing at a voice comment made by the teacher. And from one of our observations, on the last day of a science class, the teacher greeted the students, and the students greeted the teacher back. And then one student texted, "Bye, mister. We're gonna miss you. I don't know how I'm gonna spend my summer without sciences." Our WhatsApp observations supported what teachers and administrators said in interviews about the positive nature of teacher-student relationships and the ways that teachers engaged all students, regardless of their background. The use of humor and lighthearted exchanges was observed through teacher texts and voice notes and student responses, as illustrated in strings of laughing emojis and texts representing laughter, like ha 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 ha. In the face of extreme difficulties, teachers at our faith school persisted in their teaching and upheld their partnerships to support Syrian students in an integrated environment. So I suggest the notion of ordinary solidarity to capture how our faith school sustained the right to education for refugees. Bajaj and Toe describe solidarity as a relationship that challenges inequity, injustice, and colonialism as part of the daily practice of an engaged community grounded in a concrete sense of justice. And they note that solidarity requires a relinquishing of privileges on the part of members. Building on this notion, I suggest that our faith school exhibited what might be called ordinary solidarity in working with refugee students and their families. They practice this ordinary solidarity through their organic responsiveness, through equitable relationships, and through the principles of inclusion and anti-discrimination. Rather than imposing static, predetermined interventions that were formulated elsewhere, the school and its partners amended their supports to continuously meet a dynamic and deteriorating situation. They established and modeled equitable relationships with staff and with families, and they were guided programmatically and fiscally by a policy of inclusion that countered the racialized reception of refugee students. So through an orientation of that's just what you do, we just try to encourage people to accept each other and provide a good education. In this way, our faith school enacted ordinary solidarity as part of the daily practice of an engaged community challenging inequity and injustice through their refugee education response. Ordinary solidarity emerges as a counterpoint to global interventions in refugee education, which have been critiqued for dictating education responses, maintaining inequitable relationships, and even sustaining discriminatory practices. Commonplace approaches to refugee education often derive from a place of benevolence or charity that risks embodying saviorism and reinscribes deficit perspectives of local and refugee communities. Such motivations also tend to center the epistemic authority, egoism, and needs of those who are providing aid, rather than refugees and local partners, who are people with struggles, but also knowledge, agency, capabilities, and indeed ingenuity. So what we've tried to do today is invert this epistemic authority through an anti-colonial discursive framework to highlight one of the key areas presented earlier in our video. Our faith school's example suggests that ordinary solidarities demand a shift in orientation from saviorism to care. Care sustains solidarity through crises. It fosters empathy and it reduces the risk of discrimination. This shift in turn counters racism and coloniality in humanitarian relations. Ordinary solidarity thus reemerges as an anti-colonial mandate for rights-based interventions in humanitarianism, characterized by organic responsiveness, equitable relationships, and the principles of inclusion and anti-discrimination. It speaks to ongoing efforts to reconfigure humanitarian relations and structures, and as well, our own roles in forging reparative futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zacharia. I think there's so much there for us to learn from, and really appreciate the thoroughness with which you covered this important topic. We'd like to now open it up to questions and answers. If you would come back up, please. And this program is being also shown online, so we will take questions here with microphones that will be passed to you, and then also go to our online audience. So do we have questions? Okay, please come on.
Thank you for your talk. How do you, or how would you advise, in thinking about race, how as a scholar, dealing with, sort of a conceptual invention that's obviously done great harm, and sort of a ideological, monstrous thing, and address the harms that it's made, but without also importing, this binary to the world and sort of subscribing others to it in ways that kind of cancel out, nuance. I mean, you talked about in Lebanon, not wanting the Syrian kids, and these tribal issues all over the world. So, how do we repair the harms that go along with race without subscribing to its disgusting fictions?
Thank you for your question. That's a really tough question, and I think it starts when we're all differently positioned in this work. So it starts with us really interrogating our own positioning in this work, personally and professionally as well. So because we're all differently positioned in this work, we have to think about this vis-a-vis our own professional positioning, the type of knowledge work that we're trying to do. As well, it requires a real internal reckoning, which takes time and is a dynamic process. It's not something we sort of just kind of do and go. We come to a lecture, we think about it, and we're good. It's something that is, I think, an ongoing struggle for all of us that we have to really work with for a long period of time, over our lifetimes, really. And through the evolution of our work, because we have different amounts of influence at different points in our work. I think the construct of ordinary solidarity actually captures some of how that takes place in relationships and structures, or how it could take place in relationships and structures. Through an ordinary solidarity, you come back to the humanity through ideas of equitable relationships. And through that kind of very human, equitable type of relationship, new structures can be forged.
Should we go to online? No. Other questions?
Thank you very much for your insightful lecture indeed. I'm Imtiaz Ahmed. I'm from Pakistan. I'm a research scholar on the peace education at University of Maryland. So I was relating your presentation and perspective with my part of the world, like Pakistan and South Asia. And I witnessed that the countries having the colonial past and less into the decolonization of education system and their youth are more vulnerable to the extremist recruitment organizations. So do you feel any linkages and any insights to come out of this vicious cycle? I mean, they have, we can take the example of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Because of the bordering Afghanistan and Myanmar having hosted the largest population of refugees, and no initiative for decolonization of education system in both of the countries. And they're less into the integration of refugee education into the teacher education systems. So how to come out of this vicious cycles, and any insight that I can take back to those regions for reforms? Thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're seeing large populations cross over borders in many parts of the world. My own focus is on the Middle East because that is the region where I'm from. But indeed, we're seeing this, and displaced people tend to cross the border that's closest to them, and many of the contexts that they move into are hostile contexts. They have not signed on to agreements, they do not have any commitments, and maybe potentially not even the capacity, potentially, I mean, that's, I think, debatable whether there is capacity or not to integrate. You know, the example I gave, you know, arguably they didn't have capacity either, and yet they showed that they did. So you're talking about, though, a very large-scale type of issue. And so how do we begin to alter the narrative that we don't have capacity, or that we can't integrate, or that this is somebody else's problem? And that's really about working in the spaces where you are to alter the way. I mean, you're involved in peace education, so you're thinking along those veins, really thinking with localized communities about how they indeed, you know, our own well-being is connected to the well-being of others, and how we can begin to accompany our guests on their journey. And indeed, we know that most children will spend all of their childhood in displacement. And so we really can't think of them as temporary populations anymore either. So really working, I think, deeply with localized communities and trying to connect those, the well-being of the community with the well-being of those who are displaced is one of the ways that you can move forward in this area.
Questions from the audience? Dan?
That was a lovely talk. I am not in this field of study, although I do work with children's development. I guess what I would really, not to learn by negative example, but sometimes it would help me conceive better of what your goal is, which to my mind is like, how would you do anything differently, yet I sense people are. And so, is it possible to contrast this lovely example of the school that's doing what I would take to be exactly the right thing with what alternatives seem to be, roaming around that community that do not serve either the children, the community, or the future as well? I'm trying to grapple with, for instance, if we took tangibly the response to pandemic, which unfortunately put kids online with no resources, for instance, how might this school have tackled that problem in ways that other existing approaches are really not succeeding at doing?
Okay, great. That's a great question. I was trying to focus here on a positive example, as you noted, because there's plenty of work out there on the negative. And actually that kind of way of framing the problematics and the deficits is widespread. Still, it's important to know what the problems are. So in many contexts, including the gentleman's example, and also in Lebanon in general, Syrian students, although there has been a scheme to integrate them into public schools, they are not well accepted there. They are placed in what we call double shift schooling. And this is, I'm now focusing on Lebanon, but this is actually a model that global organizations use in different parts of the world. When there isn't enough capacity in terms of number of teachers, of course, this is the idea that there aren't enough teachers is because they will not hire teachers from the refugee community. So when we define teachers in a particular way, we look around and we say there aren't enough, okay? So in that sense, integrating them into public schools, they're in the second shift. So they are segregated from their Lebanese peers. In the second shift, they have a few hours of education per day, and they are taught largely by Lebanese teachers who have mixed feelings about their presence. And this is because of a deeply fraught historical reality or relationship between the two countries. So Syria occupied Lebanon for a very long time. Now they're in need of humanitarian support. So for many people, they have not forgotten what conditions were like before. So these are fraught situations. The other sort of negative thing is that students are faced with forms of direct violence. They are, there's often a lot of corporal punishment, humiliation, and so on in schools. And in a school system that is bilingual, where half the subjects are taught in English or French and the other half in Arabic, the Syrian students do not have the linguistic resources to proceed to learn mathematics in English, for example, even though they may know the concepts very well in Arabic. There have been no allowances for this. In fact, students have been shamed simply for not knowing the language. And so while a lot of work is happening in various kinds of schools to overcome this, the most ingenuity has really been observed in these non-formal spaces, and in the case of this school, this happens to be a private school that was willing to bend in different ways to try to accommodate the students. So they were teaching language after school and so on. So there's a number of issues, but language issues are one of the primary issues that are faced by young people. When you have a displacement of people, whether it's in the global south, in resource-scarce environments, or whether they're going to countries in the global north, which take in fewer of them, language differences are one of the primary dilemmas, for example, for children on the move. So, and for teachers as well. It's not easy to teach a class with students who have multiple languages, for example. The systems, I mean, the systems are strained in countries that are already fragile. And then to have an additional population to bring additional pressure to the system can be quite, can actually break the system.
That is incredibly helpful. And as some people know, my area is language, so that actually was the beautiful example for me, because that brought it home. Yeah.
And we have one from online.
Thank you. So this question comes from Deepa, who's joining us virtually. Great presentation. In your case study on our faith schools, and this follows on a little bit from the previous question, I wanted to understand if any differences in spoken Arabic impacted teaching and or learning. Also, did the school incorporate aspects of spirituality?
Great questions. For those of you who are not as familiar with Arabic, it's actually, by some linguists' perspective, it's actually multiple languages, right? So what we speak at home is not the same as what we learn at school. What we speak in our home is not the same what other Arabic-speaking countries speak in their homes, et cetera, and it can vary a lot even within a very small geography like Lebanon. However, the Syrian dialect in general and the, dialect, language without an army is called a dialect, so you can call it what you want, but the language variety that is spoken largely in Syria is quite similar to the language variety that is largely spoken in Lebanon. So these issues are not so great, especially because the formal register that is used in schools is the same, and that it is the same across the whole the whole region. So in that sense, no, that wasn't a major difference. And in terms of spirituality, you saw probably from, you got hints of it. I mean, the school is called Our Faith School as a pseudonym. And that is because, yes, the school followed a Christian faith. I don't specify that in the research for a reason, which is that when we chose this as an example, we were not following questions of spirituality or faith or religion at all. We were looking for organizations that thought they had strong partnerships. And they defined those partnerships as being strong. And so we went to see what they were about. And so in the questions that we asked, following a certain line of questioning, spirituality and faith were not part of the question. And so they also were not part of the answer. However, you can hear in some of the excerpts that I shared that spirituality and faith, in a sense, were across a lot of what was happening there. Although it's not explicit, and not in one answer did any of the participants who we worked, teachers, administrators, and so on, none of them really talked about this piece, except that the first families that came to the school were recommended to them by their church. So it had started in a particular way, but at the end, this flood of students were from multiple backgrounds and so on, and the school itself followed particular principles probably because of some kind of deep faith or spirituality. It just didn't really emerge in our data because of the nature of the questioning itself.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. And when you talk about the multi-linguistic, I was thinking about, was there any, how do you say, I'm not sure if that isn't the right term, like, was there any exclusion of the exclusion? What I want to say is, like, for example, in the case of Myanmar, like, there are a lot of refugees in fleeing to Thailand, and also inside the camp, there has been the discrimination amongst the refugee because politically, there's a majority group and minority group in Myanmar. So most of the minority people, they flee to Thailand firstly. But right now, because of the current coup, also the people from the majority are residing at the refugee camp. So like, because of this political history, there has been exclusion of the exclusion at the refugee camp. So I'm wondering what is the case in this Syria and Lebanon, and also how your suggestions on tackling these. Thank you.
So that's, yes. Yes, discrimination among refugees is a real thing. You know, we tend to think about refugees, at least, you know, from our northern perspective and when we're talking about humanitarianism and so on, as if there's like one blob of people who are all the same somehow, and they all just kind of moved from here and went over there. And the truth is really far from that. The refugees themselves are diverse, and when they first came from Syria to Lebanon, they were politically diverse. So those who supported the regime and those who did not support the regime. So you've got political diversity. They also have different, you know, have different ideas about political affiliations in general. They're economically diverse. I mean, so much so that in one of the other schools that I've spent more than 10 years in, the teachers at first, the teachers who were hired to work with they were refugee teachers who were hired to work with the students. They were actually shocked by the condition of the students they were working with because they had come from urban areas in Syria, the teachers. And they did not realize, they had not seen, and they did not realize that there was so much shocking forms of poverty in other parts of Syria, partly because of the control on information, partly because of an urban-rural divide, partly. So while you're mentioning perhaps there are other kinds of diversities, ethno-linguistic and so on, but I'm also noting that in this case we're talking about political, economic, urban, rural, in terms of experience. And also there are linguistic minorities, yes. It's also a religiously diverse space, but in terms of linguistic minorities, in some of the other schools, that was a barrier to education and also in terms of identity. You know, who are you in this space of displacement, when you're not, you know, you don't fit the standard frame of Syrian and Lebanon or whatever. So how to tackle, and in some of the schools that I've been in, I've seen teachers tackle that quite effectively by trying to appeal to students' similarities and to redefine who we are in the space of displacement. We, the teacher and the student, together, as well as with the others who are our hosts. And so I think, you know, teachers play a really, really big role in how this can go about. And despite their own constraints and difficulties, teachers go to great lengths to try to mitigate some of these tensions. And they do it because they know their community. So they know that there is this political difference. So they try to diffuse that they know that there's this ethno-linguistic tension, so they try to, or a lack of clear identity on the part of some students who are part of the minority, so meaning they're being bombarded with other kinds of messaging about who they are. And so I think teachers and school leaders can play a really strong role and try to mitigate that.
Thank you. Let's go to online.
So this question is from Neda online. Thank you for shedding light on this matter of great import and elucidating the dynamics involved at our faith school. What are some factors or lessons learned that can be shared more widely and perhaps in other parts of the world? Thank you.
I think there are a number of lessons for us here, and for different people who are doing different kinds of work. So in terms of global education governance, there are many lessons from this body of work that are specific to agencies and organizations that are working to secure the right to education for children in different parts of the world, and the ways in which they might address some of the inequities in this work. And so I've been involved with some organizations. Some of them are donor organizations, others are networks of international organizations who are involved in the space and who are seeking to address some of the inequities in terms of the extent to which, for example, refugees have the extent to which refugees have a say in terms of the education of their own children and are involved in that process, and the kinds of partnerships that would allow for that. So my general statement, because these are really specific types of areas that, to try to change the structures, in general, we need to think about how, rather than dominating this humanitarian process, how we might be able to reposition ourselves as organizations in complementary roles. So guided by the needs and desires of those populations or communities, how might we then serve in complementary roles? In our faith school, the international organization that supported them, as well as the Lebanese organization that supported them, they played complementary roles. It was the school with the families that determined what was going to happen with the education of the children. And then they sought different types of support from those organizations who served in those complementary roles. Now, in terms of general lessons for schools, I think there are some concrete practices that we need to think about. And while they look different in different types of schools, there are basic principles that could be then repurposed for these different types of schools. How can we actually enact a kind of ordinary solidarity in our schools in ways that will allow for the blossoming of children, really working with teachers to confront their own ideas, their own discriminatory practices, and supporting them with actual tools and skills that they are asking for, that they wish to have in order to support their own students. And then for the rest of us here, many of us are students and scholars, we also really need to think about how our own work embodies the kinds of saviorist ways of thinking and how we might counter that in our own work. This is not to dispel our urge to support others, or our urge, after all, wanting to help others is one of the most human of feelings. The question is, how do we do that? How do we do that without it being about us? How do we do that while decentering ourselves in our work and inverting the types of questions so that we're pursuing the questions that are needed and defined by those communities? And then how do we bring resources to those spaces as we support people on their journey and in their inquiry and knowledge work.
Any questions here? Yes, why don't you wait for that?
Thank you, Dr. Zaharia. You were talking at the beginning of the talk that there was an organization worker that says there is no equality in the relation between the donors or the big players and us. They don't take us into account, and there is distrust in the local knowledge. How organizations can find or create a space to present these issues and to present these dichotomies in terms of what they do and what they know matters.
Let me make sure I understood the question. So are you asking how do we create spaces so that different forms of knowledge are valued? I think some organizations are starting to address that, which is a positive sign. And in fact, engagement with the critique in education and emergencies over the past few years, it's sort of starting to gather some speed, which I think is important. But it's still a really tough question, because when people are invited into these conversations to sort of say represent the community, they're often tokenized. It's, they create these panels or whatever, and here, let's hear from this one refugee, and they put them on the panel to say something. Let's hear from youth who are doing. Those people are not placed at the beginning of the decision-making processes. They are add-ons. So whether it's a panel or whether it's developing a program, often local communities or refugee communities are brought in at the very end to implement, to do what's been said. So the question is how to reverse that in all these different kinds of spaces. And it really involves working out partnerships from the beginning, and having people come in from the very beginning. It requires lots of different tactics in order to do that. I mean, in the first place, there needs to be, a commitment to do that kind of real deep thinking. And that is very hard when we believe that we know better. And that their ideas are very perspectival because they can only see things from where they're positioned. Well, our ideas are also very perspectival because we can only see things from where we're positioned, right? So we have to really think about how we can reverse that. And we have seen in our research how different organizations do that. And it's through this mutual learning, this kind of organic mutual learning, and that all of the parties will grow in that process. So through ongoing communication, it's not, a top-down kind of thing, but it's something that is ongoing, and through this kind of mutual communication, you get to know your partner. And through that, the work can shift and the ways of working can really shift. So people are doing it. They're doing it in different spaces. And my feeling is, while this is not getting at the heart of the structure, as organizations and actors take the lead in their different locations, they change the field through their actions. So kind of is happening from the margins in. And people are starting to take notice.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more. Do you have anything online? Okay. Was there another question from the room? Going once? No. Okay. Thank you again for that very, very thoughtful and excellent lecture. And on behalf of the Baha'i Chair, we would like to thank you for your presentation. So let me just finish this by, okay, let me just tell you, I wanted to tell you about our next event, which will be on April, let me be sure here, April 15 at 3 p.m. And we're going to feature a book that the Baha'i Chair has published on infrastructure, well-being, and the measurement of happiness. And it's an edited volume, and we will feature two of the authors that contributed chapters to this very, very interesting volume. The first is Professor June Thomas from the University of Michigan. Her area is urban development and deals with racial issues. And then the other professor is Carol Riff, who is a psychologist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's done extensive work on the psychology of human happiness and well-being. And so we really encourage you. It'll be an online event, a virtual event. We encourage you to join us. And if you're interested in our events, we also encourage you to sign up on these sheets in the back, and we'll put you on our list. And we have all kinds of social media platforms that we encourage you to follow us on those. Today's lecture is recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel probably in the next couple of days. So you can also go back and listen to it if you feel like there was something that was missed or whatever. Anyway, I really appreciate you all coming out today. Another thank you to Kate for organizing this event, and of course to Dr. Zina Zacharia for her excellent presentation. Thank you again. All the best to all of you. Bye-bye.